James Boswell. Journal of a Tour to the Hebrides. 1. Edinburgh, Fifeshire and Aberdeen. Boswell's first considerable book was a lively description of his tour in Corsica, but his fame rests on his Life of Dr. Johnson, see Lives and Letters, and his Journal of a Tour to the Hebrides with Samuel Johnson, LL.D. was really the first portion of that great work, and was meant, as he himself said, to delineate Dr. Johnson's manners and character more than to give any detailed descriptions of scenery. We have chosen to include it in the travel section of our work, however, as it might be more readily looked for there than under Johnson in the department of Lives and Letters. The journal was published in the autumn of 1785, about 9 months after the death of Johnson. Dr. Johnson had for many years given me hopes that we should go together and visit the Hebrides. In spring 1773, he talked of coming to Scotland that year with so much firmness that I hoped he was at last in earnest. I knew that if he were once launched from the metropolis he would go forward very well. Luckily, Mr. Justice, now Sir Robert Chambers, conducted Dr. Johnson from London to Newcastle, and Mr. Scott, of University College, Oxford, accompanied him from thence to Edinburgh. On Saturday, August 14th, 1773, late in the evening, I received a note from him that he had arrived in Boyd's Inn, at the head of the Canongate. I went to him directly. He embraced me cordially, and I exulted in the thought that I had him actually in Caledonia. He was to do me the honour to lodge under my roof. We walked arm in arm up the High Street to my house in James's Court. It was a dusky night, but he acknowledged that the breadth of the street and the loftiness of the buildings on each side made a noble appearance. My wife had tea ready, which it is well known he delighted to drink at all hours, and he showed much complacency upon finding that the mistress of the house was so attentive to his singular habit. On Sunday after dinner, Principal Robertson came and drank wine with us, and there was some animated dialogue. During the next 2 days we walked out that Dr. Johnson might see some of the things which we have to show at Edinburgh, such as Parliament House, where the Lords of Session now hold their courts, the Advocates' Library, St. Giles's Great Church, the Royal Infirmary, the Abbey of Holyrood House, and the palace, where our beautiful Queen Mary lived, and in which David Rizzio was murdered. We set out from Edinburgh on Wednesday, August 18th, crossed the Frith of Forth by boat, touching at the island of Inchkeith, and landed in Fife at Kinghorn, where we took a post-chaise, and had a dreary drive to St. Andrews. We arrived late, and were received at St. Leonard's College by Professor Watson. We were conducted to see St. Andrew, our oldest university, and the seat of our primate in the days of episcopacy. Dr. Johnson's veneration for the hierarchy affected him with a strong indignation while he beheld the ruins of religious magnificence. I happened to ask where John Knox was buried. Dr. Johnson burst out, "I hope in the highway. I have been looking at his reformations." We left St. Andrews August 20th and drove through Leuchars, Dundee and Aberbrothick to Montrose. Travelling onwards, we had the Grampian Hills in view, and some good land around us, but void of trees and hedges. And the doctor observed that it was wonderful to see a land so denuded of timber. Beyond Lawrence Kirk we visited and dined with Lord Monboddo, and after a tedious journey we came to Aberdeen. Next morning Principal Campbell and other college professors called for us, and we went with them and saw Marischal College. Afterwards we waited on the magistrates in the town hall. They had invited us to present Dr. Johnson with the freedom of the town, which Provost Jopp did with a very good grace. Dr. Johnson was much pleased with this mark of attention, and received it very politely. It was striking to hear the numerous company drinking Dr. Johnson, Dr. Johnson, and then to see him with his Burgess ticket or diploma in his hat, which he wore as he walked along the streets according to the usual custom. We dined with the Provost and a large company of professors at the house of Sir Alexander Gordon, Professor of Medicine, but there was little or no conversation. 2. Through the Macbeth country. We resumed our journey northwards on the morning of August 24th. Having received a polite invitation to Slains Castle, we proceeded thither, and were graciously welcomed. Lady Errol pressed us to stay all night, and ordered the coach to carry us to see the great curiosity on the coast at Dunby, which is a monstrous cauldron, called by the country people the Pot. Dr. Johnson insisted on taking a boat and sailing into the Pot, and we found caves of considerable depth on each side. Returning to the castle, Dr. Johnson observed that its situation was the noblest he had ever seen, better than Mount Edgcumbe, reckoned the first in England. About 9, the Earl, who had been absent, came home. His agreeable manners and softness of address prevented that constraint which the idea of his being Lord High Constable of Scotland might otherwise have occasioned. He talked very easily and sensibly with his learned guest. We left Slains Castle next morning, and driving by Banff and Elgin, where the noble ruins of the cathedral were examined by Dr. Johnson with a patient attention, reached Forres on the night of August 26th. That afternoon we drove over the very heath where Macbeth met the witches, according to tradition. Dr. Johnson solemnly recited, "How far is called to Forres? What are these so withered and so wild is their attire? They look not like the inhabitants of the earth, and yet are on't. From Forres we came to Nairn, and thence to the manse of the minister of Calder, Mr. Kenneth Macaulay, author of the History of St. Kilda, where we stayed the night, after visiting the old castle, the seat of the Thane of Cawdor. Thence we drove to Fort George, where we dined with the governor, Sir Eyre Cooty, afterwards the gallant conqueror of Hyder Ali, and preserver of our Indian Empire, and then got safely to Inverness. Next day we went to Macbeth's castle. I had a romantic satisfaction in seeing Dr. Johnson actually in it. It perfectly corresponds with Shakespeare's description, which Sir Joshua Reynolds has so happily illustrated in one of his notes on our immortal poet. This castle has a pleasant seat. The air nimbly and sweetly recommends itself unto our gentle senses. Just as we came out of it, a raven perched upon one of the chimney tops and croaked. Then I repeated, "The raven himself is hoarse, that croaks the fatal entrance of Duncan under my battlements." On Monday, August 30th, we began our equitation. We had 3 horses for Dr. Johnson, myself, and Joseph, my servant, and one which carried our portmanteaus, and 2 Highlanders walked along with us. Dr. Johnson rode very well. It was a delightful day. Loch Ness and the road upon the side of it, shaded with birch trees, pleased us much. The night was spent at Fort Augustus, and the next 2 days we travelled through a wild country with prodigious mountains on each side. 3 in the misty Hebrides. We came at last to Glenelg, and next morning we got into a boat for Skye and reached the shore of Armadale. Sir Alexander MacDonald, chief of the MacDonalds in the Isle of Skye, came down to receive us. Armadale is situated on a pretty bay of the narrow sea, which flows between the mainland of Scotland and the Isle of Skye. In front there is a grand prospect of the rude mountains Moidart and Knoydart. Dr. Johnson and I were now full of the old Highland spirit, and were dissatisfied at hearing of racked rents and emigration, and finding a chief not surrounded by his clan. We attempted in vain to communicate to him a portion of our enthusiasm. On September 6th we set out, accompanied by Mr. Donald MacLeod as our guide, for Corrishatachin, in the district of Strath. This farm is possessed by Mr. Mackinnon, who received us with a hearty welcome. The company was numerous and cheerful, and we, for the first time, had a specimen of the joyous social manners of the inhabitants of the Highlands. They talked in their own language with fluent vivacity, and sang many Erse songs. The following day the Reverend Donald McQueen arrived to take us to the island of Rasay in McGillicallum's carriage. Along with him came as our pilot Mr. Malcolm MacLeod, one of the Rasay family, celebrated in the year 1745 to 46. We got into Rasay's carriage, which was a strong open boat. Dr. Johnson sat high on the stern like a magnificent Triton. The approach to Rasay was very pleasing. We saw before us a beautiful bay, well defended by a rocky coast, a good family mansion, a fine verdure about it, with a considerable number of trees, and beyond it hills and mountains in gradation of wildness. A large company came out from the house to meet us as we landed, headed by Rasay himself, whose family has possessed this island above 400 years. From Rasay we sailed to Portree in Skye, and then rode in wretched weather to Kingsburg. There we were received by Mr. Alan MacDonald and his wife, the celebrated Miss Flora MacDonald. She is a little woman of a genteel appearance, and uncommonly mild and well-bred. Dr. Johnson was rather quiescent, and went early to bed. I slept in the same room with him. Each had a neat bed with tartan curtains. Dr. Johnson's bed was the very bed in which the grandson of the unfortunate King James II lay on one of the nights after the failure of his rash attempt in 1745 to 46. To see Dr. Samuel Johnson lying in that bed in the Isle of Skye, in the house of Miss Flora MacDonald, struck me with such a group of ideas as is not easy for words to describe as they passed through the mind. He smiled and said, "I have no ambitious thoughts in it." Upon the table I found in the morning a slip of paper on which Dr. Johnson had written with his pencil these words, "Quantum sedat virtutibus aurum." With virtue weighed, what worthless trash is gold? What the doctor meant by writing them, I could not tell. At breakfast he said he would have given a good deal, rather than not have laid in that bed. Kingsburg sent us on our way by boat and on horseback to Dunvegan Castle. The great size of the castle, which is built upon a rock close to the sea, while the land around presents nothing but wild, moorish, hilly, and scraggy appearances, gave a rude magnificence to the scene. We were a jovial company, and the laird, surrounded by so many of his clan, was to me a pleasing sight. They listened with wonder and pleasure while Dr. Johnson harangued. The weather having cleared, we set out for Ulinish, the house of Mr. MacLeod, the sheriff substitute of the island. From an old tower near the house is an extensive view of Loch Bracadale, and, at a distance, of the Isles of Barra and South Uist. And on the land side the Cuillin, a prodigious range of mountains capped with rocky pinnacles in a strange variety of shapes. From there we came to Talisker, which is a beautiful place with many well-grown trees, a wide expanse of sea and mountains, and, within a quarter of a mile from the house, no less than 15 waterfalls. Mr. Donald Maclean, the young Laird of Col, was now our guide, and conducted us to Ostig, the residence of Mr. Martin Macpherson, Minister of Slate. There were great storms of wind and rain which confined us to the house, but we were fully compensated by Dr. Johnson's conversation. We then returned to Armadale House, from whence we set sail for Mull on October 3rd, but encountered during the night a dreadful gale, which compelled the skipper to run his vessel to the Isle of Col for shelter. We were detained in Col by storms till October 14th, when we safely crossed to Tobermory, in the island of Mull. Ponies were provided for us, and we rode right across the island, and then were ferried to the island of Ulva, where we were received by the Laird, a very ancient chief, whose family has possessed Ulva for 900 years. Next morning we took boat for Inchkenneth, where we were introduced by Cole to Sir Alan Maclean, the chief of his clan, and his daughters. On Tuesday, October 19th, we took leave of the young ladies, and of our excellent companion. Colonel Sir Alan obligingly undertook to accompany us to Icolmkill, and we proceeded thither in a boat with 4 stout rowers, passing the great cave Gribon on the coast of Mull, the island of Staffa, on which we could not land on account of the high surge, and Nuns Island. After a tedious sail, it gave us no small pleasure to perceive a light in the village of Icolmkill, and as we approached the shore, the tower of the cathedral, just discernible in the moonlight, was a picturesque object. When we had landed upon the sacred place, Dr. Johnson and I cordially embraced. I must own that Icolmkill did not answer my expectations, but Dr. Johnson said it came up to his. We were both disappointed when we were shown what are called the monuments of the kings of Scotland, Ireland, and Denmark, and of a king of France. There are only some gravestones flat on the earth, and we could see no inscription. We set sail at midday for Mull, where we bade adieu to our very kind conductor, Sir Alan Maclean, and crossed in the ferry boat to Oban, from whence next day we rode to Inverary. The Reverend John Macaulay, one of the ministers of Inverary, accompanied us to Inverary Castle, where I presented Dr. Johnson to the Duke of Argyll. Dr. Johnson was much struck by the grandeur and elegance of this princely seat. At dinner, the Duchess was very attentive to Dr. Johnson, who talked a great deal, and was so entertaining that she placed her chair close to his, leaned upon the back of it, and listened eagerly. Dr. Johnson was all attention to her grace. From Inverary we passed to Rosedow, the beautiful seat of Sir James Colquhoun, on the banks of the Loch Lomond, and after passing a pleasant day boating round the loch and visiting some of the islands, we proceeded to Cameron, the seat of Commissary Smollett, from which we drove in a post-chaise to Glasgow, inspecting by the way Dumbarton Castle. 4. In the west of Scotland. During the day we spent in Glasgow, we were received in the college by a number of the professors, who showed all due respect to Dr. Johnson, and Dr. Leachman, principal of the university, had the satisfaction of telling Dr. Johnson that his name had been gratefully celebrated in the Highlands as the person to whose influence it was chiefly owing that the New Testament was allowed to be translated into the Erse language. On Saturday, we set out towards Ayrshire, and on November 2nd reached my father's residence, Auchinleck. My father was not quite a year and a half older than Dr. Johnson. His age, office, and character had long given him an acknowledged claim to great attention in whatever company he was, and he could ill brook any diminution of it. He was as sanguine a Whig and Presbyterian as Dr. Johnson was a Tory and Church of England man, and as he had not much leisure to be informed of Dr. Johnson's great merits by reading his works, he had a partial and unfavourable notion of him, founded on his supposed political tenets, which were so discordant to his own that, instead of speaking of him with that respect to which he was entitled, he used to call him a Jacobite fellow. Knowing all this, I should not have ventured to bring them together, had not my father, out of kindness to me, desired me to invite Dr. Johnson to his house. All went very smoothly till one day they came into collision. If I recollect right, the contest began while my father was showing him his collection of medals, and Oliver Cromwell's coin unfortunately introduced Charles I and Toryism. They became exceedingly warm and violent, and in the course of their altercation, Whiggism and Presbyterism, Toryism and Episcopacy were terribly buffeted. My father's opinion of Dr. Johnson may be conjectured by the name he afterwards gave him, which was Ursa Major. However, on leaving Auchinleck November 8th for Edinburgh, my father, who had the dignified courtesy of an old baron, was very civil to Dr. Johnson, and politely attended him to the post-chaise. We arrived in Edinburgh on Tuesday night, November 9th, after an absence of 83 days. My illustrious friend, being now desirous to be again in the great theatre of life and animated exertion, took a place in the coach, which was to set out for London on Monday, November 22nd. But I resolved that we should make a little circuit, as I would by no means lose the pleasure of seeing Sam Johnson at the very spot where Ben Jonson visited the learned and poetical Drummond. Accordingly, we drove on the Saturday to Roslin Castle, surveyed the romantic scene around it, and the beautiful Gothic chapel. After that, we proceeded to Hawthornden and viewed the caves, and then drove on to Cranston, the seat of Sir John Dalrymple, where we supped, spent the night, and passed on to the inn at Blackshields. There, on Monday morning, Dr. Johnson joined the coach for London. Dr. Johnson told me on parting that the time he spent in Scotland, the account of which I have now completed, was the pleasantest part of his life.